In the late afternoon, as the sun disappeared below the horizon and darkness settled in, the train rolled slowly down the tracks. It pierced the desert lands. Shrouded in darkness and mystery, there was an air of suspense and unpredictability in the carriages, as if each passenger was hiding his or her own story. Among the passengers was a young man named John. He was sitting in a corner of the carriage, staring intently out the window. Suddenly, the train began to slow down and the news of the breakdown reached everyone. Passengers began to whisper and look around nervously. Everyone was waiting for evacuation or for help to arrive. Minutes turned into hours, and the mood in the car became tense. At this time, John decided to go outside to reconnoiter the situation. He opened the door and stepped out onto the open platform. Between the cars, the cold wind blew round his face, making him faint with fear. John looked around and noticed that the train had stopped in a gloomy and abandoned place. The nearest inhabited station was far away, and there was no one around. A dark forest could be seen in the distance, looking menacing and mysterious. Feeling unsure, John decided to return to the wagon. However, when he tried to open the door, it slammed shut with a crash. Panic gripped him, and he began pounding on the glass, asking the passengers to open the door. But all he heard was the sound of his own desperate screams, lost in the darkness. John realized he had been left trapped. His heart pounded harder as he heard strange sounds coming from the woods. Rustles, groans, unimaginably loud screams broke through the silence of the night, and clear shadows began to move between the trees. Like ghosts coming to life in the darkness, fear gripped John, and he realized he was in danger. He listened to the sounds, trying to determine their source. Suddenly, there was a high-pitched screech from deep in the woods. John pressed his hands to his ears, trying to drown out the sound that seemed to penetrate to the very depths of his being. He realized that something inhuman was lurking among the trees. John's heart pounded frantically as he realized that he would have to fight for his life. He felt that the forest was watching him, testing his resilience and determination. The creaking footsteps began to approach, and he decided to run. John penetrated deep into the woods, trudging through impassable thickets and obstacles. His breathing turned to groans, and his feet beat desperately against roots and rocks. He knew he had to find shelter, or an unknown fate awaited him. Finally, John found an old abandoned hut deep in the woods. In the light streaming through the dust-covered windows, it seemed the last hope of salvation. He prayed that there were no people in it. John's heart pounded in his chest as he crept to the door of the cabin and carefully opened it. There was emptiness and darkness inside. He entered and closed the door behind him. Trying not to make a sound, fear still sat in his chest, but he felt relatively safe. Meanwhile, the shadows in the woods fell silent. The ominous screeching ceased, and the frightening footsteps disappeared. The cabin was enveloped in a grim calm. John breathed a sigh of relief and looked around. The cabin, though neglected, seemed a safe haven for the time being. He felt his legs wobble and decided to rest for a while before continuing on his way. He found a small wooden bench in the corner of the room and sat on it, resting his head on his hands. The echoes of the scary sounds from the forest were still echoing in his ears. And he knew that his adventure was just beginning. But in this moment, he longed for peace and safety. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a rustling sound. From outside the cabin, John jumped up from the bench, straining his hearing, trying to figure out what was going on. Footsteps and voices became discernible. Someone or something was approaching the cabin. He went to the window and cautiously opened the curtain. What he saw outside the window startled him. They were ghostly figures, vague and indistinguishable, approaching from all directions. They were dressed in filthy, tattered clothes, and their gazes were full of despair and malice. John retreated, gripped by terror. What were these ghosts and where had they come from? They filled the air with the smell of death and sorrow. He felt they were haunting him, and the cabin was no longer a safe haven. In a panic, John decided to get out of the hut. He opened the door and rushed out into the night, trying to escape the ghostly shadows chasing him. He ran through the woods, ignoring the prickly bushes and branches that scratched his skin. Every step felt like his last, but he kept going forward, on the verge of exhaustion. Eventually, John ran out of the woods and onto an empty road. He turned around to make sure no one was following him. There were no footprints or signs of ghostly figures behind him. He breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that it looked like they were staying in the woods. John continued down the road, and his feet carried him farther and farther into the darkness of the night. The wind whispered softly in his ears, as if trying to convince him that the danger was over, but he could still feel the presence of what haunted him in the forest. After several hours of walking, he finally saw headlights in the distance. A car was approaching him. He raised his hand and waved, asking him to stop. The driver bravely stopped the car and opened the window. "Do you need help?" the driver asked with sympathy in his voice. John breathed a sigh of relief and told the driver about his horrors on the train, the mysterious ghostly figures, and his escape from the cab. The driver nodded understandingly. "You were caught in something mystical, my friend," he said. "This place is known for its sinister reputation. Legend has it that the train that passes through here is a magnet for lost souls, and on some nights, when darkness envelops the area, they come alive and haunt those who find themselves in their path." John felt terror run down his spine. "But how am I going to get out of here?" he asked with anxiety in his voice. The driver smiled. "Don't worry, I'm here to help you. Get in the car and I'll take you someplace safe. There is no place here for those who prey on lost souls.